Right. Well, thanks for having me come on today. This was appreciated. And if there's anything that comes up, just put a question in chat and I'd be happy to answer the question if I see it as we go. Otherwise, we can have a long discussion at the end. That's fine too. So I'm Mike Saunders. I'm an associate professor at Harvard Silviculture at Purdue. I've done a lot. I've been here about 12, 13 years now. Doing a lot of work at looking at the effects of forest practices, both on forest structure and composition, but also on wildlife. I do quite a bit of associated wildlife research in my lab. And in recent years, I've been focusing a lot on prescribed fire and looking at the effects of fire in our forest. I'm in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and I'm also a scientist in the Hardwood Tree Improvement and Regeneration Center, which is a group of scientists from the Purdue and the U.S. Forest Service that looks at regenerating our forests, both like in a reforestation sense and like in an ag field as well, or in an afforestation sense like in an ag field, but also in a reforestation sense after forest harvesting. So I want everybody to kind of imagine in their mind, what is the first image that comes to your mind when you think about fire in the forest? Okay. And I would probably guess that 90% of you would have some image similar to this, where you have a large flagration. The whole forest is on fire, top to bottom. This typical example of a crown fire, a Western fire that we see in the news, reported in the news. You know, currently we have some major fires in California. We've heard earlier this year it was in Australia. This is what we typically think about when we think about forest and fire. However, these types of events, although they're not unheard of in the eastern forests, they very rarely occur, particularly in our hardwood forest. Instead, what we'll get in our hardwood forest and in natural dynamics, natural disturbances, is we'll get fires like this. Slow creeping fires that run through the understory of the forest, slowly burning the vegetation, the litter, the dead twigs, dead branches on the ground, and maybe killing some of the smaller stems that are in the understory, and maybe some of those larger saplings. These are all examples of surface fires. In these surface fires, this type of fire is thought to have been pretty widespread in the eastern forest prior to settlement, prior to European settlement. Much of our forests have a signature of fire, and that's not really widely known. So we now, as forest managers, we now commonly use prescribed fire to achieve a variety of objectives, from regeneration to rehabilitation of the forest, to creating wildlife habitat, among other things. So today I want to kind of go over what fire is as a natural disturbance to forests. And I'm gonna focus mostly on the surface fire, these types of surface fires. And I'll give some examples from out west and then move to the east. I'll talk about basically just the how-to. How do I actually put a prescribed fire in the ground? What is involved, the benefits, the drawbacks to that. And then I'll end with an example of prescribed fire that we did in one of our research projects in southern Indiana. So as I alluded to, fire is a natural component of most of our forests in North America. This map of North America, it comes from a paper out of Missouri, from a research group out of Missouri, who basically modeled using the climate, using basically the native vegetation patterns, the amount of fuel that was available. They basically modeled how frequent fire could occur on any given spot in the US. So this is what this mean fire interval year is down here. And all these colors refer to different intervals. So the hotter the color, the shorter the period between when you would expect fire to touch any part of the ground in that area and touch it again. So, you know, a return interval of 4 years means that if it burned this year, I would expect to see it burn again, plus or minus a little bit of error in another 4 years. And if you can look at Indiana here, we are in pretty hot colors. From the northern part to the southern part of the state, the expectation would be that fires could potentially burn here definitely less than every 20 years, and maybe as often as every 10 years. Now, some of this is probably driven by the remnants of prairie that we have in the area, but most of Indiana settlement was forested. There's estimates that 80 to 85% of the state was forested at the time of settlement. So this was all driven by climate and the forest types we had at that situation. Now we go out west, you know, when we think right now of where all the fire is in the country, we see a lot of cooler colors. These are, you know, hot, anywhere from 20 to even over 100 years between returns. That's primarily driven from the fact that these are systems that are very dry. They accumulate fuels very slowly, so everything grows slowly. Plus, those systems are driven by crown fires, the things that we see on television. So this is a really good kind of template to understand how important fire was in the eastern US, across North America, as well as in the eastern US. So I'm going to begin with a couple of examples out west, or one example out west of looking at ponderosa pine, and this is throughout the western US, but I'll have pictures from Oregon and from Arizona. We'll talk then about longleaf pine systems in the southern US. And then I'll finish here talking a little bit about oak systems in the central hardwood region and throughout most of eastern North America. So ponderosa pine, again, it's a common forest type on dry sites in western US. This is kind of the first big trees as you go from the grasslands up into the mountains. This is usually the first band of trees that you'll run into. The Black Hills is one exception, where the Black Hills is almost entirely ponderosa pine, if you've ever been there. There's a few other places in the country where you have that predominant of ponderosa pine. Some places in Arizona and New Mexico have that kind of pure stands of ponderosa pine, but it rarely is in that pure form. And this is a poster child. This is a poster child for forests for the effects of fire suppression in the West. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a bit. But first, I want you to look at this picture that I include on this slide, and I want you to see this kind of wall of green, okay? This is a ponderosa pine near Bend, Oregon. I want you to see that wall of green. That is not what a ponderosa pine forest should look like. The ponderosa pine forest in that picture has densities probably 10 to 100 times higher than it should be. And it's full of what's ladder fuels. Ponderosa pine fields don't have an understory. They're very park-like. And what happens is when we get a lightning strike after like some thunderstorm out west where we don't have a lot of rain, and it starts the grass on fire, or it starts a small tree on fire. In a normal ponderosa forest, that won't do much. But when you have a bunch of ladder fuels, what happens is that fire is moving and creeping along the ground, and then all of a sudden it gets next to some small shrubs, the flame length gets higher, gets into small trees and regeneration and saplings, the flame length gets higher and yet. And then eventually you're just building a ladder of fuels that goes clear up in the overstory. And this is what creates the crown fire conditions and the big burns that we see in some parts of the West. Without ladder fuels, the forest should look like this. Okay, so if a lightning strike hits the ground, it burns the grass in that area. It can creep through the whole forest, and it's not going to catch the overstory on fire. If lightning hits a tree and an individual tree starts on fire, usually these forest types don't have the branches from that tree usually are not touching other branches from surrounding trees. The trees are kind of separated from one another. So that individual tree might burn up and die, but it won't catch the whole forest on fire. So this is a system that's really, really dependent on surface fires. And if you've been in that part of the state, like in Arizona, New Mexico, southern Colorado, these systems are really prone to big fires now because we suppressed all the fires. We allowed all these small trees to fill up in the understory. So by using surface fires periodically, we basically burn out that understory. We burn some of those small trees and we keep the trees widely spaced and just occasionally allow one of those small trees to get to the overstory. So when you start looking at these forests, some of these old trees, these veteran trees will have, fire scars every 5 to 10 years in some of these systems. You can actually date these with dendrochronology, with tree rings, just counting tree rings, and looking at the healing patterns along this cat face here, what we call this wound. We call this a cat face. And you can actually date when each one of those fires came through. And there's on this cookie 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 fires, prescribed fires came through here. So we can use prescribed fire to help emulate that condition, open these stands up so that they're not so prone to crown fires. Because crown fires are really catastrophes. Surface fires just maintain the ecosystem's resilience. There's a lot of the species in those systems in the understory, even the wildlife species, are adapted to those type of surface fires. They're not adapted as well to crown fires. We can also reduce fire intensity with forest management. I'm sitting on this picture's from the top of a ridge in northern Arizona. And basically, I'm sitting on the edge of a large, I think it was 150 or 200,000 acre fire. It was one of the largest fires in Arizona in a half a century. That fire came up from behind me and was just roaring. And, 100 to 200 foot flame lengths came down over this ridge, worked its way down the ridge, and then all of a sudden it got to the bottom of the ridge and it dropped to the ground. Meaning that it went from a crown fire down to a surface fire almost immediately. And that was because of forest management. In the foreground, this area, they had not done nothing. They had basically left the forest alone, where in the background, they had cut down about half to 2/3 of the trees and really tried to open that stand up so that the tree crowns weren't touching and try to make it look like a more natural ponderosa pine forest. And by doing so, it made that crown fire go down to the ground and it saved that stand. So we can do this stuff with forest management as well. All right, let's move east. If you went to the southern US, the southeastern US, this is probably a pretty common sight you'll see throughout Texas, clear through North Carolina, down into Florida. Rows and rows, acres and acres of loblolly pine plantations. And loblolly pine plantations, loblolly pine is not a real great fire adapted species, but it grows really fast and it produces a large proportion of the lumber that we use for home constructions throughout the US. In creating this big tree farm in the southern U.S., one ecosystem really took the hit, and that was the longleaf pine ecosystem. This is an endangered ecosystem, one of the most endangered ecosystems in the U.S., probably right along there with longleaf or with tallgrass prairie. There used to be 90 million acres of this ecosystem in the southern U.S., and there's only 3.54 million acres left. And of this, only about 12,000 acres are really high quality, old growth or really late, really mature examples of this system. There's a lot more that's been in various periods of various stages of restoration. It's a critical habitat for a lot of threatened and endangered species. And two of the most charismatic ones are the red cockaded woodpecker, which I have a picture here along with the nest box, and the gopher tortoise. The gopher tortoise in particular is a really keystone species in this system because there's, I think I once read over 50 animals, 50 different vertebrate species use their burrows in some part of their lifespan. The existence of this forest type strongly depends on surface fire. Longleaf pine systems are very grassy, savanna-like systems, and they depend on surface fires pretty regularly to be maintained. The tree species itself is adapted to fire because it goes through a grass stage. It actually grows on the ground and forms, if you weren't knowing what you're looking at, you would think it was just bunch grass. But these are actually tree seedlings. And so the longleaf pine will hang out there for a few years and will put almost all of its growth below ground. Then, we're not sure what triggers it, but at some point it will just decide, hey, I need to grow tall. And this is an adaptation to get above surface fire, okay? So these systems will burn every other year. And this all burn off like a regular grass prairie, but that bud, that growth meristem will basically be protected with most of the resources of the plant below ground. So then when it gets a break and decides to go, it puts all its growth and height growth, it throws up a really fat bud, a really fat stem that's resistant to be burning off, and it gets above the surface fire. So here's a picture of a longleaf pine stand that has recently been burned. And you can see some of these small saplings that broke out of that grass stage, they do die, but some make it through. And a mature longleaf pine stand might only have 20 trees per acre. So you can lose quite a few of these trees through periodic fire. What happens when we don't have fire? Well, without fire for 2 years, the system will start to look like this. And this is in one of the richer parts of the range for this species. It's in northern Florida and southern Georgia. So things are growing really fast here, but the understory is filling up very, very quickly with oaks and scrub oaks and other shrubs. And at this stage, it's perfect to throw another fire through. You can burn those oaks and those shrubs back. It's going to be an intense fire, but you're going to still maintain the system. Now, if we wait another 6 years and we don't throw fire through, these oaks and this understory now is 12, 15 feet tall. Now when this burns, it will actually get into the overstory. And we basically have a crown fire, and it kills all the overstory trees. So this longleaf pine ecosystem is really dependent on periodic surface fires. Okay, my last example, and we'll talk more about this, is obviously the oak hickory forest. And most of the southern half of Indiana is in this forest type. It's linked explicitly to fire. In fact, most of the eastern U.S., this whole green box, this dark green area, is all oak hickory forest type. It's 36% of all the forest land in the eastern U.S. It has 123.6 billion cubic feet of timber volume. And it's estimated it has $500 billion of value just in stumpage. It has a lot more value in that in terms of ecological services. It sequesters 3.2 billion tons of carbon. It's one of the most important sources of food for birds and mammals in the eastern U.S. It's thought that it contains, there's over 200 vertebrate species that depend on oak and hickory, those two species, for their lifespan. A lot of bird species, a lot of mammal species require oak and hickory in portions of their lifespan. It supports a higher biodiversity than maple and beech forest that, as I'll talk a little bit about later, those two forests dominated by those two species would eventually replace oak and hickory without fire. There's been some recent research that actually says oak and hickory actually reduce nitrous oxides emissions compared to maple and beech through the mycorrhizal in their roots. So they actually don't cause, believe it or not, maple and beech cause a little bit of air pollution compared to oak. And obviously, it's a major recreational source used for a significant portion of the U.S. population. Over 150 million people live within a day's drive in oak hickory forest. Probably hearing my dog in the background. In these oak hickory forests, basically the fire controls species composition in these eastern forests. When we have low surface fires, low and infrequent surface fires, it really pushes our forest types more towards a maple and beech type forest. Maple and beech, these species are pretty intolerant of fire. They have thin bark, so they're killed easily by surface fire. The characteristics of the litter they produce actually makes a forest less likely to burn over time. So the more maple and beech you have in a forest, the harder it is to burn it. Whereas if you have a frequent fire regime, where you have surface fires pretty common, you're really going to favor oak. And if it gets really common, you're going to go moving into more pine type systems. So basically this is kind of a gradient. So the more frequent you go from oak and pine, less frequent to maple and beech, and we can have forest types throughout the eastern U.S. that kind of fall anywhere on this gradient, and it kind of changes the composition. So we're really concerned about oak and hickory in the eastern U.S., and we've been so it's been recognized for well over 50 years. This is some data from southern Indiana through an experiment that I helped manage. And basically, to boil this down, in a nutshell, I'm going to look at my big screen so I can point some stuff out. These are different size classes of trees, like the diameter of the trees in 5-inch classes. And this is just the proportion of trees in each one of those size classes by the different species groups. So the dark green is our maple. The light green is hickory. The red is yellow poplar. And the orange is our oaks. What we would like to see is not necessarily this whole thing orange. What we would like to see is a good proportion of this oak, but it being consistent across all size classes. That would mean these lines are relatively flat between the areas. And that would allow basically small oaks to replace big oaks in that stand. Likewise, small maples replace big maples in that stand. What we see instead is a lot of very big oaks and a lot of little tiny maples. So over time, over the next 20 to 30 to 40 years, these maples are going to grow up and replace these oaks as these oaks are die from old age, they're harvested, or they simply fall out of the stand from disturbances like windstorms and etc. So our forests over the next 50 years are going to become more and more dominated by maples. And there's probably nothing we can do about it under the current management prescriptions. We'd have to start managing a lot harder, a lot more intensely. Oaks, and part of this reason we can't do a lot is we can't burn everywhere that we need to. Oaks are highly dependent on fire. Fire plays a key role in several parts of the life cycle of an oak. Fires, these surface fires basically help thin out stagnant overstory trees, keep maple out, keep some of the mid-story out, decreases the stem density so there's really nice light conditions on the ground to allow germination. It burns off the seed bed, or burns off the litter. It burns out some of the decomposing duff to expose mineral soil so the acorns can basically germinate into mineral soil and grow more effectively. After germination, we build up this pool of advanced regeneration of small seedlings that basically are just waiting for an overstory opening to occur. Fires help create these openings, and it also helps dissuade, or dissuade's not the right word, it basically filters out the regeneration, so it's mostly oaks making it into the overstory, and it's killing off, the fire's killing off the maple and the beech in the understory, whereas the oaks, having most of their growth below ground, can resprout readily after fire, being adapted to fire. So there are several places where fire plays a key role in perpetuating oaks in our forest, and we just don't have the capacity anymore to burn as much as happened prior to European settlement. So we will lose some of our oak forest over time, there's no doubt. But we have to work to try to maintain it where we can. And unlike in many other regions of North America, our thoughts are the predominant ignition source was likely Native Americans and not lightning. So prior to settlement, there's always been this idea that lightning is what caused oak regeneration, or caused these large oak forests in the eastern US, all this lightning. Well, if you think about lightning in the eastern US, it's a lot different than lightning in the western US. In the eastern US, lightning comes with rain, and it's kind of hard for things to burn when they're wet. So the current thought now, and there's a lot of evidence that actually Native Americans set a lot of the fires in the eastern US and really structured the composition of our forests in the eastern US a lot more strongly than we recognized even 10 years ago. So you got to realize that Native Americans were here when the glaciers left. There's strong evidence of that right now that has been coming out recently. And so our forests have never known, at least in the last 10,000 years, they've never known a period without human habitation. And there was an awful lot of Native Americans here, a lot more than people often realize. There's a lot of really exciting work in anthropology kind of highlighting this fact that I'm bringing into my fire ecology just in the last few years. All right, I'm going to show a quick video. I always like to break this up into a little video so you don't have to see me talk all the time.
Excellent. I want to burn that piece by the office. Wind's just right. Burn it real nice.
Now, I know what you're thinking, but it's okay. This is not an act of arson or a wildfire. And no, he's not crazy. He's actually the burn boss, the leader of a highly skilled fire team. And they actually started this fire. Usually thought of as only destructive, Fire is necessary for many plants and animals around the world, and for the water we drink.
Here in Florida, we get that water from rain, which flows through the ground. We do not burn any of this stuff, and the ground begins to develop lots of layers of vegetation. It takes a lot longer for water to get down, and some water may just simply pool on top and evaporate back up. So with areas that have a lot of exposed ground, allows the water to really sink down into the aquifers quickly, and allows the quantity of water to be as good as it can be. So our ability to put fire on these natural areas really benefits people.
Tell that to the people living within 300 feet of this. Yet on the day of this fire, no complaints were made. Many residents here understand that this intentional fire was in part set to minimize or prevent an unintentional wildfire.
A controlled burn is also known as a prescribed fire because when the doctor gives you a prescription, he's trying to give you something or a specific goal or function. And there's lots of reasons why we actually conduct these prescribed fires. They could be for the benefit of the animals within the site. They could be for the benefit of plant species. They could be for the benefit of people that live nearby. So it benefits people, plants, and animals. And sometimes, and actually more often than not, a good prescription benefits everything.
By reducing the fuel or things that burn, you're reducing the potential for an out-of-control fire. In other words, you can actually use fire to fight fire, protecting people and their homes. And before fire ever helped us with water and protection, it's been shaping this habitat for millions of years.
Florida is positioned in a unique place where we have more lightning strikes per square mile than anywhere else in the United States. What that means is, over a long period of time, these plants and animals have been bombarded with lightning continuously. So the plants and animals have developed lots of great adaptations to deal with and depend upon fire.
One plant suited to fire is the namesake of this ecosystem, the longleaf pine. It actually promotes and then takes advantage of fire. Its pine needles fall and make for easy and quick burning fuel. And when fire comes around, the tree's loose flaky bark falls off so fire can't take hold. After surviving the fire, the tree's seeds then have exposed and nutrient-rich soil that germinated. An amazing animal, both dependent and uniquely suited to fire, is the gopher tortoise. These professional diggers depend on quick-growing grasses that are first to sprout after a fire clears an area. During the fire, their burrows offer shelter for the tortoise, and over 200 other animal species call it home. That's a lot riding on a tortoise and fire. And keeping fire on this land is easier said than done.
We have been changing the face of this landscape. Humans have come in and put in roads and houses and things, and in doing so, we have obstructed what once was a flow of fire through the landscape. Lightning or people would do fires, fire would just simply flow and stop when it just simply stopped. But we can't allow that to happen anymore. So we have to take upon us a mantle of responsibility to put fire back on this landscape. The torch has been passed literally from lightning to us. So we're taking the place of that, looking at what is best for the ecology of the landscape and the safety of people that live next to these sites.
Alongside the plants and animals of this ecosystem, we too have adapted to and become dependent on fire. Short of grabbing a literal torch, there's a lot we can do to carry it. These young scientists at the Disney Wilderness Preserve outside of Orlando, Florida, are taking part in a controlled burn, monitoring weather conditions to keeping fire within prescribed lines. If you can't stand the heat, get out into the preserve's other areas to help track invasive species or monitor important wildlife like Florida's only endemic bird, the scrub jay.
We have in Florida an incredibly diverse amount of life. If we find them within areas that are preserved and managed for wildlife and plants, we can apply fire at a set interval based on ecological principles to maintain those species. So in a way, like a gardener would apply the right amount of water, fertilizer, attention to grow a crop. By applying fire at a certain time, we essentially are growing a crop of really healthy longleaf ecosystem.
An ecosystem that yields crops like longleaf pine, gopher tortoises, and drinking water. Nature works hard, and that's why we work hard for nature.
So this is a good pathway into talking about how we actually do prescribed fire. When we go out, I mean, this is a fire that I was involved in, and we have a large number of personnel on site when we're starting this fire. But before we even get to this point, there's a lot of work that's already been done. We do a lot of planning and preparation for these prescribed fires. We determine what the objectives are for the fire. The objectives are going to help tell us when we want to burn, what kind of intensity we want the fire to have, or like flame lengths. Are we burning grasses? Are we burning understory leaves? Available, the weather conditions that we're going to need to do that. And then it helps us determine how to lay in fire lines and fell hazard trees. So fire lines are basically areas around the periphery of the planned fire where we basically remove all fuels or reduce the fuels significantly. And basically this can be anywhere from a couple feet wide to 10 or 20 feet wide, depending on the intensity of the fire we want. Sometimes we'll use actually on those fire lines on the day of those fires, we'll actually put in a wet line of foam or even just spraying the vegetation that's still remaining with water. We'll fell hazard trees, and in a forest, when we're trying to do a surface fire in a forest, we'll fell hazard trees or snags and stuff that could catch fire and carry fire up like a chimney and throw sparks and ashes that might land on the other side of the fire line where we don't want the forest to burn. So we do a lot of this work, and then we notify obviously everybody that could potentially see the fire or be affected by the fire. And this is all done in a prescribed burn plan. So almost every fire in Indiana and in many parts of the Eastern North America is going to have a burn plan in place. Because if something goes wrong, you need to have everything, if something happens that you didn't expect, by having this burn plan and doing all your preparation, you're going to be able to have everything basically laid out on what you're going to do in case of that fire escaping and getting over the fire line in an event of that. On the day of the fire, we'll start. We'll look at the fire lines again, check the periphery of the site, making sure there's no more hazards, no trees have fallen down over the fire line, that kind of stuff. And then we'll do a small test fire to make sure the fire's acting like we expect. If the fire's not acting like we expect, maybe it's burning too hot, we might not burn that day. We might pack it up and leave. Most of the time, we'll put the fire down and it won't burn as hot as we want. Sometimes, but that's always a danger in some of our forests, and we'll come back a different day. And then basically we'll go around this fire line and we'll put in what's called a black line. And what we're doing is, if the wind is blowing towards this fellow from our perspective towards him, that fire is going to push the flames over the fire line, okay? So what we're trying to do basically is then have that fire slowly burn back away from that fire line towards basically where the picture taker is standing, the photographer is standing, and create an area where all the fuel has already been burned. It's all black. The fuel is black. And that acts as basically, if there's no fuel, there's no fire. So this adds an additional safety margin around on top of our fire lines to prevent escapes. The higher the flame length, the wider and the higher the winds, the wider we want that combination of fire line and black line to be. Oops, I went the wrong way. So that's kind of how it looks with with the fuel line here, the black line here, and this is slowly burning into the forest. When we're comfortable, we have enough of the periphery burned, then we will ring the fire, basically going around the rest of the periphery of the fire and starting on fire, and then letting the fire drive intensively, a head fire at the front, so the wind is pushing the flames, and that allows the flames to get taller and more intense, and that will push through the forest and we'll get and achieve our objectives. And we're constantly monitoring to make sure we're getting the conditions that we want, the result we want in terms of consumption of fuel, the flame heights we're looking for, and adapt to conditions. Sometimes if we see flame lengths getting too high, there's firing techniques. There's ways we can put prescribed fire in the ground to reduce the flame lengths that we're seeing. So we adapt on the fly to changing weather conditions, changing field characteristics. And then when we're all done, it'll look like this, and we come through the forest and we start looking for these things, these burning things near our fuel line, that we might, these snags, these old dead trees that we might have to drop so that we don't have this thing burning through the night and throwing sparks across our fire line. So we do mop up and clean up, making sure that everything is out or is not in danger of burning across the fire line when we leave the site. So here's a little example. This is a video showing how we were doing a prescribed fire out at Martell Forest, west of town, that Purdue owns. So drone video. You can see the individual dropping fire from what's called a drip torch. So some of the benefits to using prescribed fire, particularly in a forest, is to favor tree regeneration. A lot of times we're looking at oak and hickory. We're reducing the thickness of the leaves, the litter, and the fine twigs on the forest floor. This exposes mineral soil and allows for better regeneration. Sorry. Computer's lagging on me a little bit. We also, by doing that burning, we're also releasing nutrients that were locked up in that litter, and particularly if we have more organic soils, this release of nutrients acts as a pulse, kind of like fertilizes the site, so that things grow. The regeneration that's developing can grow much more quickly. And again, then we're trying to kill these tolerant species in the understory to increase the amount of sunlight we see on the forest floor. But there's a great deal of benefits for the wildlife. Generally, when we're doing these burnings in these types of forests, we're going to increase the abundance of herbaceous and grassy species on the forest floor. So it'll shift the composition of the forest away from a really, really shrubby forest floor with a lot of small saplings to much more of kind of a more park-like condition where you're going to have a lot of herbaceous vegetation and a lot of grass and sedge on the forest floor. And that actually increases the diversity of the forest ecosystem and often creates an increase overall of biodiversity, of number of insects you'll see, and on down the food web. Again, it shifts the composition more to oats and other masting species. It reduces clutter in the mid-story. Some of our endangered species like Indiana bat really don't like to have a lot of mid-story, a lot of small saplings and small trees underneath the canopy. They want it to be relatively open because then they can forage better. And then it creates a heterogeneous forest structure. It kills scattered overstory trees. So you have patches of young regeneration next to areas where there's no regeneration and under mature trees. So it changes our forest from being a little bit more homogeneous, makes it much more heterogeneous. And that basically increases the amount of habitat, different types of habitat available for wildlife. If you do it enough times, you can create very woodland and savanna type systems. So you can, and when you have, this is often a desired condition when you get out like in the Missouri Ozarks, trying to create this very grass dominated understory under a few scattered overstory trees, either barely touching in a woodland type situation or trees that are totally isolated from one another in a savanna type situation. But there are disadvantages. In Indiana, our fire windows are narrow. It's very hard to burn in Indiana sometimes. We only have a burn season in the fall for a couple of weeks towards the end of October, early November. In the spring, it's a little longer, somewhere from early February through the mid-April. But if basically as soon as things start to green up, you can't burn anymore. That's not the time when we get the most intense burns. Obviously, if we wanted to really burn hot, do it in the middle of a drought in the summer. That's kind of what would have happened probably pre-settlement, but that's not when we can do it this day and age. And that's not when the system. So that's when what oak was probably adapted to is those really intense burns in the middle of the summer, but we can't burn at that time. So a lot of our fires just don't achieve the same intensity of what natural fire did in the past. That means multiple burns are often needed to get the same effect. And that increases logistics, that increases cost. But it's still cheaper to burn than many of our other options, particularly in creating oak regeneration. Prescribed fires can be thought of as an alternative to herbicide use in some of these systems. And if you don't want to use herbicides, you can think about using prescribed fire to help control the vegetation and promote more oak regeneration. However, burn is becoming less socially acceptable because of the smoke and because of the liability concerns around escape. So I'm going to quickly go through this last part here so we have some time for questions. Here's just an example of prescribed fire in Indiana forest. This is in southern Indiana near Crane. It's actually on a military base down there. This is a typical mid-story on many of the sites you'll see in southern Indiana. What we did here is a prescribed fire to favor oak. And the primary goal of this fire was to remove litter and duff to create regeneration sites, create some areas where we'd get some tree regeneration, and kill the mid-story and high fuel areas. We did this burn in the fall of 2014. The temps on that day started in the 60s, ended in the 70s. Relative humidities were 20 to 30%. In our burn temps, we used some specialized equipment to figure out how hot the burn was, and they exceeded 600 degrees Fahrenheit in some spots. But on average, the whole site burned at about 350 degrees Fahrenheit. You did get these really, really intense hot spots where there was a lot of fuel accumulations, but you also got these other areas that barely burned. In our results, is it consumed most of the litter and small woody fuels, reduced the duff in the layer of old decomposition leaves. So basically achieved most of our objectives. We got some mid-story kill, exposed mineral soil, and it was really a nice looking site when you're all said and done. We did get a little bit of a scorch on overstory stems, but nothing that really caused any long-term damage. And in 2 years, we had a plethora of oak regeneration on the ground. So this was a very successful burn. And we're actually looking at the responses of this now 5 years after the burn to see if that oak regeneration stuck around or we're going to have to burn again. So I was going to show one more video, but I think to allow some more time for questions, I think I'm going to end it there. This is my contact information, and you're more than welcome to email me or call me if you have any questions. And with that, I will take.
Well, let me thank you again for joining us tonight and on this interesting topic. So we are, I don't see, oh, we got a couple questions. So one is, do we know how Native Americans managed their fires?
So the thought was, I see they're both kind of related. I have a private question too. Two questions are related. Native Americans are thought to have used fire. They knew that fire could promote certain species and dissuade others. So they would actually use fire for creating conditions for berry picking, favor some of our rubus species, raspberries and other species. So they would use fire to keep the forest able to produce that kind of situation. They would use fire to clear travel lanes so it was easier to travel through the forest. They used fire as an offensive and defensive weapon against adjoining, from neighboring tribes. Native Americans are thought to use fire for multiple purposes. There was even thought that they used fire sometimes to clear the forest so they could do short-term slash and burn agriculture. There's some examples of that as well. Probably not on as large a scale, but there was definitely examples of that. Prescribed burn at Martell, that was done. I try to do a prescribed burn every fall with my silviculture students. And then in the spring, Purdue does a prescribed burn in a grassland area at the Purdue Wildlife Area, usually in end of March or sometime in April. We couldn't do it this year because of COVID, but we do. Honestly, some of the properties that we own that we have a lot of grass on, we can burn that even. I did some burning the day after New Year's this year just because the weather conditions were right and we didn't have snow on the ground. So we'll burn those grassy areas off when we can get the right conditions. Woodland burns, though, are a lot harder to pull off outside of those windows I alluded to earlier. Well, I mean, if you wanted to use it to mimic a herbicide, I think that depends on what your garden's around. I mean, fire, if you're adjoining other, if you're in town, I don't think you can do it in town. In the county, you can do it. You possibly could do it, but most of the private companies that can do burning would probably, they're going to want several acres that they have kind of before they're even going to invest the time. There's kind of an upfront cost to burning, and it probably is going to be too expensive. There's like a fixed cost at the very front, and that's probably going to be too expensive for most individuals to burn a garden. I will tell you that I do burn my garden, but I live out in the countryside. And
so I used to burn my leaves on the garden. That's where I would rake all my leaves and I would burn them on the garden.
I do.
So I've done that, and I think he's probably a little frustrated with the amount of Canada thistle at our extension gardens right now. So they do make flame weeders, which is not really like a prescribed burn, but it's just a propane tank that has a very direct flame on it that you can just burn the tops off weeds. So maybe that's something we invest in for the gardens.
Yeah, again, inside this, I've had the county call, I've had the fire department come to my house, even though I knew what I was doing, just because in our state, there is a lot of different, every county, sometimes every township has different regulations in terms of like burning and like even burning ditches or burning fields. And sometimes it's hard to navigate all those. So before you do any burning, you definitely got to check with kind of some of your local, like with your local fire department, and figure out what the regulations are about burning. For example, I ended up burning one evening after dark because it was windy that day, had dried everything out. And that was actually, in terms of the ecology and in terms of the fire behavior, that was the safest time to burn on that day. But in the township that I live in, you cannot burn after dark. So I had to put that out. So it's things like that we have a Indiana Prescribed Fire Council that's trying to work through some of these discrepancies on what our knowledge of fire is, like safe behavior, and how we can use it effectively. And that's a group that's kind of working towards helping to kind of alleviate some of those inconsistencies in law and codes regarding fire. Pretty much fire conditions that would favor hickory are going to be pretty much the same as oak. Hickory is not as fire tolerant. This was a question I got off a chat. Hickory kind of tags along with oak, but I don't think we've ever really worked out in that fine a detail what conditions, like what fire intensities, what flame heights would favor hickory over oak. It generally is not as fire resistant as oak. We're seeing that in some of our studies. So it would probably be a little bit lower in intensity than what you would see with oak. We usually don't have quite as many regeneration problems with hickory as we do with oak, however. So I'm a little bit more consistent of a mass producer or a seed producer. Sally Casey asked me, do I work with the DNR to burn at Prophetstown State Park? I have not burned out at Prophetstown State Park. Some of our students will go up and help watch, but the state parks don't really want us to be involved. I do work with the Indiana Division of Forestry, and I do work with them to do some of my prescribed fires. And then we have a group at Purdue that we do prescribed fires on our own lands.
Well, thank you. And you have a beautiful yard. I'm a bit jealous that I couldn't have done this from my backyard as well. So thank you again for joining us tonight. And we've got your contact information if we have any questions. We are growing a prairie out here at the Extension office. When we first started planting, there was talk of like small burn demonstrations for some of the local fire departments and things, but we'll see if we ever get there. Right now, it's just getting started, so it'll be at least.
I do have a student group. Again, it's really tough to know how it's going to work this year with COVID, but we do have a student group in a couple classes that can do small burn areas of small burns. So, you know, they can do 1/4 acre burn. That's no problem.
Yeah, so it's almost 2 acres out there. That
we can do that too.
Seeded it just last winter, dormant seeding, and so it's going to be mostly forbs and the wildflowers with a little bit of grass. So we'll see. Just
all right.
Well, thank you.
Well, good luck with that. You're welcome.
And for everybody left on, I will get this recording up as quickly as I can and out to you all. So thanks for joining us and have a good evening.